The streets of New York City were alive with motion, honking cabs, hurried footsteps, and the hum of a metropolis that never slept. On the corner of Fifth Avenue and West 34th Street, near the towering presence of the Empire State Building, a lone musician sat on an overturned milk crate. His name was Ethan Hayes. A guitar rested on his lap, its wooden body scratched and worn from years of use. His fingers plucked the strings effortlessly, filling the air with a melancholic, yet hopeful, tune. Pedestrians passed him without a second glance, their minds occupied with phone calls, business meetings, and coffee runs. But Ethan didn't care. He wasn't playing for them. He was playing for himself, and for the memories that refused to fade. The CEO who stopped walking, high above the bustling streets, inside the sleek glass tower of Sterling Enterprises, Julian Sterling stood in his corner office, staring at the city below. At 42, Julian was a self-made billionaire, the kind of man who had clawed his way to the top with relentless ambition. He had everything: power, influence, and wealth beyond imagination. Yet something was missing. Lately, the world felt hollow. His assistant, Eleanor, knocked softly on the door. "Sir, your car is ready." Julian nodded and grabbed his coat. He had another business dinner to attend, another soulless evening spent discussing profit margins and investments. But fate had other plans, a song that stopped time. As Julian stepped out of the building, adjusting his cufflinks, something unusual happened. A sound, soft at first, then unmistakably beautiful, drifted through the air. A guitar, a voice. His steps slowed. People walked past him in every direction, but Julian's ears locked onto the melody, as if the world had suddenly dimmed around him. The song was achingly familiar. His gaze followed the sound until it landed on a young man sitting on the sidewalk. His eyes closed as he sang into the night. Ethan. Julian's breath caught in his throat. It wasn't just a song. It was his mother's song. A song he hadn't heard in 20 years. His world tilted. A connection beyond time. Julian never stopped for street performers. He barely noticed them. Yet now he found himself frozen, staring at this stranger who had unknowingly pulled a piece of his past back into the present. Memories rushed in, of a small apartment, of a mother humming this very tune as she cooked dinner, of a boy who still believed in magic before the world hardened him. And now, here it was again, sung by someone who had no way of knowing what it meant. Julian's heart raced. Who was this man? And how did he know that song? The final note faded into the night. For the first time in years, Julian Sterling did something he never did. He reached for his wallet, not to drop money into the guitar case, but to start a conversation. Because this was not a coincidence. This was fate. Ethan had felt it before, the moment when a stranger's gaze lingered just a little too long. Some people stopped because they recognized a song, others because they liked the melody. But this was different. This man wasn't just listening. He was remembering. Ethan saw it in his eyes. A flicker of something deep, something personal. The man, tall, sharp suit, presence that screamed authority, stepped forward, reaching into his coat. Ethan braced himself. Most people either dropped a crumpled bill into his case or asked him to move. Instead, the man pulled out a business card. "I need to speak with you." Ethan raised an eyebrow, strumming a random chord. "Most people just toss a buck and keep walking." The man didn't smile. "I'm not most people." No, he definitely wasn't. Ethan hesitated, then glanced at the card. Julian Sterling. The name hit like a bolt of lightning. Everyone in New York knew that name. Julian Sterling was a billionaire, a CEO, a man who built an empire from nothing. Why the hell would he want to talk to him? A deal on the table. Julian gestured toward the cafe on the corner. 5 minutes of your time. I'll buy you a coffee." Ethan smirked, still gripping his guitar. I usually charge more than coffee for private performances. Julian didn't flinch. Then name your price. Something about the way he said it, like money was no object, like whatever he wanted he got, sent a strange chill through Ethan. But there was curiosity now, because Ethan had played in this spot for years. He had seen thousands of faces, heard hundreds of passing compliments, and yet this was different. He slung his guitar over his shoulder. Fine, he said, but I picked the coffee shop. Julian nodded once. Lead the way. The song that changed everything. Inside a dimly lit cafe, Ethan wrapped his hands around a steaming cup of coffee, watching as Julian sat across from him, eyes sharp and calculating. The man was unreadable, a storm behind polished glass. Finally, Julian spoke. The song you played? His voice was steady, but his hands were curled into fists on the table. Where did you learn it? Ethan blinked. That's what this is about? Julian's jaw tightened. Just answer the question. Ethan exhaled. It's an old tune. Not many people know it. My mother used to sing it to me when I was a kid. Julian froze. Something flickered in his eyes. Something almost painful. Your mother? He repeated. Ethan leaned back. Yeah, before she died. A beat of silence. Then Julian leaned forward, his voice lower now. Controlled, but tense. What was her name? Ethan frowned. Look, man, What was her name? Julian pressed. Ethan's stomach twisted at the intensity in his voice. Clara, he admitted. Julian inhaled sharply. His fingers gripped the edge of the table. Ethan had no idea why, but he knew one thing for sure. This wasn't just about the song. This was about his mother. And Julian Sterling wasn't just some random billionaire. He knew something. Something Ethan had never been told. Ethan had spent years wondering about his past. Now, he was staring at a man who might actually have the answers. Julian Sterling sat across from him, his posture stiff, his expression unreadable. But there was something in his eyes, something haunted, like he had just seen a ghost. Ethan's fingers tightened around his coffee cup. What the hell is going on? He asked. Why are you asking about my mother? Julian exhaled slowly, his gaze dropping to the table. I knew her, he said. A long time ago. Ethan's stomach dropped. His heart started pounding, memories flashing through his mind. His mother's soft voice, the way she would hum that song while cooking dinner, the way she always avoided talking about his father, the way she always looked over her shoulder, as if she was afraid someone might be watching. Ethan narrowed his eyes. You knew my mother? Julian's jaw tightened. Yes. Ethan leaned forward, anger bubbling beneath the surface. Then where the hell were you when she died? A name buried in the past. Julian flinched. It was small, barely noticeable, but Ethan caught it. For the first time since they sat down, Julian looked guilty. I didn't know, Julian said quietly. He ran a hand over his face. I thought she left. Ethan frowned. What? Julian swallowed hard. He looked older now, as if the weight of whatever he was about to say had been crushing him for years. Your mother, he said, wasn't just some woman I met once. She was... He hesitated. She was supposed to be my family. Ethan felt the world tilt. What are you saying? He asked, voice barely above a whisper. Julian met his gaze. I think I might be your uncle. The pieces start to fit. The words hit like a freight train. Ethan stared, waiting for the punchline. The joke. The moment this stranger, this billionaire, admitted he was screwing with him. But Julian Sterling wasn't laughing. He looked like a man who had just uncovered a ghost from his past. Ethan's mind raced. His mother never talked about her family, never mentioned siblings. Hell, she barely even talked about his father. But if this was true, if Julian was telling the truth, it meant that all these years, Ethan had family out there, rich, powerful, and completely unaware of his existence. Ethan let out a shaky breath. You don't know for sure. Julian's lips pressed into a thin line. No, he admitted. But I know Clara, and I know that song. She wrote it for my brother. Ethan's stomach turned. His father. A man he had never met. A man his mother refused to talk about. He didn't know whether to laugh or scream. Julian leaned forward. Ethan! If there's even a chance that we're family. Ethan shot up from his chair, shaking his head. Number, you don't just get to show up after all this time and drop something like this on me. Julian stood too. I didn't know you existed. Ethan let out a bitter laugh. Yeah? Well, neither did I. The cafe was suddenly too small, the walls too close. Ethan slung his guitar over his shoulder. This was a mistake. Julian reached for him. Ethan! But Ethan was already gone. A Song for the Lost. The night air bit at his skin as Ethan stormed down the street, his head spinning. He had spent his whole life believing he was alone. Now, in the span of an hour, a billionaire had just told him otherwise. He didn't know whether to believe it. Didn't know if he wanted to believe it. All he knew was that his hands were shaking, his mind was racing, and there was only one thing that had ever calmed him down. Music. He dropped onto a bench, pulled his guitar into his lap, and let his fingers find the chords. A familiar melody spilled into the night, the same one he had played earlier. His mother's song. His song. Maybe his father's song, too. The one thing that tied them all together. A voice interrupted him. You play even better when you're angry. Ethan looked up. Julian stood a few feet away, hands in his coat pockets. He didn't look smug. He looked sad. Ethan clenched his jaw. You followed me. Julian exhaled. I'm not going to force this on you. Ethan scoffed. Really? Because it kind of feels like you are. Julian hesitated. I just want to help. Ethan studied him. For a moment, just a moment, he saw something real. A man who wasn't just a billionaire. A man who had lost something too. Ethan sighed, his grip loosening on the guitar. I don't need your money. Julian nodded. Good, because I'm not offering money. Ethan narrowed his eyes. Then what are you offering? Julian met his gaze. A second chance. Ethan let Julian's words hang in the air. A second chance. He wasn't sure whether to laugh, scoff, or walk away. Because what did that even mean? A second chance at what? A family? A different life? For years he had learned not to expect anything from anyone. Hope was a dangerous thing. It made you weak, made you believe in things that weren't real. And yet, somewhere deep inside him, a part of him wanted to believe. Ethan exhaled sharply. You don't even know if we're actually related. Julian nodded. Then let's find out. Ethan blinked. What? Julian reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small envelope. A DNA test. Simple, quick. If we're not family, I walk away. Ethan hesitated. And if we are? Julian's expression softened. Then I do what I should have done years ago. Ethan studied him carefully. And what's that? Julian's jaw clenched. Then softly, almost regretfully, he said, I don't know yet. Memories of a Forgotten Life. Ethan took the envelope but didn't open it. Not yet. Instead, he let his fingers trace the edges, his mind racing. For years, his mother had avoided talking about her past. He had assumed she was just protecting him from some painful memory. But what if she had been running? What happened to my father? Ethan asked suddenly. Julian stiffened. That told Ethan everything. He leaned forward. You knew him, didn't you? Julian exhaled, running a hand over his face. Yes. Ethan's stomach tightened. And? Julian hesitated. For the first time, he looked uncertain, as if he wasn't sure how much to say. Finally, he sighed. Your father was my brother, and he was troubled. Ethan's heart lurched. What do you mean? Julian's fingers curled into fists. I mean, he wasn't the man your mother needed him to be, and he made mistakes. Ethan swallowed. Big ones? Julian's eyes darkened. Yes. There was something else there, something Julian wasn't saying. Ethan felt a flicker of anger. I deserve to know the truth, he said. Julian nodded slowly. You do, but not here. Ethan narrowed his eyes. Then where? Julian hesitated. Then he said, Come with me. The penthouse in the past. 15 minutes later, Ethan found himself in a place he never imagined he'd be. Julian's penthouse. It was exactly what he expected. Luxurious, sleek, and absurdly expensive. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked the city, the kind of view Ethan had only seen in magazines. But he didn't care about any of that. He cared about why he was here. Julian poured himself a drink, then motioned for Ethan to sit. I don't expect you to believe me, Julian started, but I need you to listen. Ethan crossed his arms. I'm listening. Julian took a deep breath. Your father, Daniel, and I grew up in a wealthy but very strict household. My father, your grandfather, was a man who believed in power above all else. He had no patience for weakness. Ethan stayed silent. Julian continued, his voice quieter now. Daniel, he wasn't like me. He was restless, wild. He wanted out of the family business, out of my father's control. He exhaled. And then he met your mother. Ethan's chest tightened. My father hated her, Julian admitted. Said she wasn't worthy of the sterling name. He threatened to cut Daniel off. But your father, he didn't care. Ethan gripped the edge of his chair. Julian hesitated. Then one day they were gone. Ethan frowned. Gone? Julian's eyes darkened. Vanished. No note. No warning. Just disappeared. Ethan's breath caught in his throat. That didn't make sense. His mother had never spoken about running away. She had never mentioned being forced into hiding. And if Julian was telling the truth, that meant she had been hiding from the Sterlings. Ethan's mind raced. His mother had been running. From what? From who? Julian set his glass down. When I finally found out where she had gone, it was too late. She had already passed away, and I never found Daniel. Silence. Ethan could hear his own heartbeat. You think he's dead? He said quietly. Julian hesitated. Then finally he whispered, I don't know. Ethan felt something inside him crack. For years he had thought his father had simply abandoned them, left his mother to raise him alone. But what if that wasn't true? What if his father had been taken? Or worse, what if he had been running too? A dangerous choice. Ethan felt a storm brewing inside him. Why are you telling me this now? He asked. Julian met his gaze. Because if there's a chance that my brother is alive, we need to find him. Ethan's breath hitched. You think he's out there? Julian's jaw tightened. I think someone knows what happened to him. And if we start asking questions, we're going to attract attention. Ethan's pulse spiked. There was something in Julian's tone, something that sounded an awful lot like warning. Attention from who? Julian took a slow sip of his drink. From people who don't want the past uncovered. Ethan swallowed hard. This was no longer just about music or a lost family. This was about something bigger, something dangerous. And if he stepped into this world, if he started pulling at these threads, There would be no turning back. Julian leaned forward, his voice firm. "I need to know if you're in, Ethan." Ethan exhaled slowly, his mind screaming at him to walk away. But his heart was already in. Finally, he met Julian's gaze. "I'm in." Ethan had made his choice, and there was no turning back. Julian studied him carefully, as if trying to determine whether Ethan truly understood what he had just agreed to. "This isn't a game," Julian warned. "The people my father was connected to, they don't like loose ends." Ethan scoffed. "Yeah? Well, I've spent my whole life being a loose end. Guess I'm used to it." A flicker of something, respect maybe, passed through Julian's eyes. Then he stood. "We need to start at the beginning." Ethan frowned. "And where's that?" Julian's voice was calm, but firm. "With the last person who saw your father alive." A visit to the forgotten. An hour later, Ethan found himself standing outside a gated estate in the quiet suburbs of New York. The mansion was old but well-maintained, its towering iron gates casting long shadows under the dim streetlights. Ethan turned to Julian. "Who lives here?" Julian's jaw tightened. "A man named Marcus Grayson." Ethan's breath hitched. "Grayson?" Julian nodded. "He was my father's business partner, and the last person to see Daniel before he disappeared." A cold chill ran down Ethan's spine. "And you think he knows something?" Julian didn't answer. Instead, he pushed the buzzer beside the gate. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then, a voice crackled through the intercom. "Sterling?" Julian's lips pressed into a thin line. "Open the gate, Marcus." Silence. Then, with a mechanical click, the gates creaked open. Ethan's pulse quickened. Something about this felt wrong. But he followed Julian up the long driveway anyway, because if Marcus Grayson had answers, he was going to get them. The man in the shadows. Marcus Grayson was older than Ethan expected. With silver hair and piercing blue eyes, he looked like someone who had spent his entire life making deals in the dark. His gaze flicked between Julian and Ethan as he leaned against his massive oak desk, swirling a glass of whiskey in his hand. "Well," he said, his voice smooth and practiced, "this is unexpected." Julian didn't waste time. "What happened to my brother?" Marcus chuckled. "Straight to the point. That's always been your style, Julian." Ethan's patience was already wearing thin. "Did you know my father?" Marcus studied him, then let out a slow sigh. "I did." Ethan stiffened. "And?" Marcus took a sip of his drink. "I warned him." Ethan's blood ran cold. Julian's expression darkened. "Warned him about what?" Marcus set his glass down, stepping closer. "That your father was in over his head." Ethan's hands curled into fists. "What the hell does that mean?" Marcus let out a breath. "Your father made enemies. Dangerous ones. He got involved in something that was far beyond him." Ethan's heart pounded. "And you just let him disappear?" Marcus's gaze hardened. "No." Silence. Then, softly, he said, "I helped him." Ethan froze. Julian stepped forward. "What do you mean?" Marcus hesitated. Then, finally, for the first time, his mask slipped, and Ethan saw it. Regret. "I helped him disappear," Marcus admitted. "Because if I hadn't, he would have been killed." The room tilted. Ethan's breath hitched. "So he's alive?" Marcus's expression didn't change. "I don't know." Ethan's stomach twisted. But Marcus wasn't finished. He stepped even closer, lowering his voice. "But if you want to find out, you'll need to be careful." Ethan swallowed hard. "Careful of what?" Marcus's voice dropped to a whisper. "The same people who came for your father might come for you." Nowhere left to run. The warning sat like a stone in Ethan's chest as he and Julian left the mansion. The night air felt heavier now, the world suddenly more dangerous than it had been a few hours ago. Julian ran a hand through his hair. "I need time to process this." Ethan barely heard him. His father had been hiding, running. From what? Or who? And now, if they started looking, would those same people come after him? Ethan's fingers tightened around his guitar case. He wasn't afraid of a fight. But what if he was already in one? And what if he had been his whole life, without ever knowing it? The drive back into the city was silent. Ethan sat in the passenger seat, his mind racing with everything Marcus had said. His father had been running, and now, if they kept looking, so would he. Julian's hands tightened on the steering wheel. "We need to lay low for a while." Ethan shook his head. "Number I want answers." Julian exhaled. "You're not thinking clearly. If we make the wrong move, we could be putting ourselves in—" Screech. A pair of blinding headlights cut across their path. Julian slammed the brakes, just in time to stop from crashing into the black SUV that had swerved in front of them. The city street was too quiet. Ethan's stomach dropped. Then, the SUV doors swung open. Men in dark suits stepped out. No words, no hesitation. One of them reached inside his coat. Ethan's heart slammed against his ribs. They were here. The people who had been chasing his father, now coming for him. Julian's voice was sharp. "Get out!" Ethan's breath caught. "What?" Julian's hand gripped his arm. "Run! Now!" Ethan hesitated, just for a second. Then, gunfire ripped through the night. Running through the dark. Ethan hit the pavement hard, rolling as the glass from the car's shattered windows rained down around him. Julian was already moving, grabbing him by the jacket and pulling him into the alley. Footsteps pounded behind them. They ran. Ethan's lungs burned as he sprinted through the darkened streets, weaving between trash cans and fire escapes. Somewhere behind them, a voice shouted orders. Julian yanked him toward a side door, kicking it open. They stumbled into a dimly lit storage room. Old shelves, the smell of dust and cardboard. Julian slammed the door shut behind them, breathing heavily. Silence. Then, Ethan heard them. Boots on pavement. They were close. Ethan's pulse hammered. "What now?" Julian's jaw was clenched. "We don't stop." Ethan's hands shook. "This is because of me." Julian met his gaze. "This is because of the truth." A pause. Then softly, "Do you still want it?" Ethan's breath was ragged, his mind screaming at him to turn back. But his heart? His heart already knew the answer. He nodded. Julian exhaled. "Then let's end this." They didn't stop running until they reached a rundown warehouse near the harbor. Julian pulled out his phone, dialing a number. Ethan leaned against a wall, trying to catch his breath. Then, he noticed something. Across the room, beneath a broken desk, was a dusty, abandoned guitar case. Something about it felt familiar. Slowly he walked toward it. His fingers brushed over the worn leather, the initials faintly visible on the top. DS. His breath hitched. Daniel Sterling. His father's guitar. Ethan's hands shook as he unlatched the case. Inside, resting among faded fabric, was something he hadn't expected. Not just a guitar. A letter. It was addressed to him. Julian's voice broke the silence. "What is that?" Ethan's throat was dry as he carefully unfolded the letter. The handwriting was old, rushed. Then he saw the first line. "Ethan, if you're reading this, I didn't make it." His breath caught. It was from his father. Ethan's hands trembled as he read, "I never wanted to leave you, but if I stayed, they would have killed us both. I had to disappear." His chest tightened. "I hope that one day you will understand. And maybe, if fate is kind, you'll find Julian. Trust him." Ethan blinked hard, his throat burning. Music will always lead you home. The letter ended there. Ethan couldn't move, couldn't breathe. His father hadn't abandoned him. He had been protecting him. And the one person he told him to trust? Julian. Ethan looked up, tears burning his eyes. Julian's expression was unreadable. He left this for you. Ethan swallowed hard. He wanted me to find you. A long pause. Then Julian nodded. And now? Ethan exhaled shakily. Now we finish what he started. Julian studied him for a moment, then held out a hand. Ethan didn't hesitate. He shook it. And for the first time in his life, he wasn't alone. A week later, Ethan sat on a new street corner. His old guitar was gone. Now, in his lap, was his father's guitar. He strummed a few chords, soft, familiar. A song that had followed him his whole life. The one his mother used to sing. The one his father had written. The one that had led him here. As he played, a few people stopped to listen. And then, a shadow passed over him. Julian stood nearby, hands in his pockets, watching. Ethan smirked. "Gonna toss a tip this time?" Julian rolled his eyes. "Let's go. We have work to do." Ethan grinned. Then he slung the guitar over his shoulder and followed his newfound family into the unknown.